Some other things I want to get to, Paul, because I have best laid plans, and now we're in coaching conversation, so it's kind of the natural segue. For the first time in 17 years, someone other than Nick Saban on the sidelines in Tuscaloosa, and Kalen DeBoer. We know Jim Harbaugh went off to the NFL, leaving Sharon Moore with bits and pieces of a Michigan team that shouldn't be ranked ninth in the country. They lost too much. It's no disrespect to Michigan. You won the national championship. Enjoy it. You're not the ninth best team in the country. They struggle with Fresno State, pulled away late. For your money, the debuts yesterday starting in Tuscaloosa with Kalen DeBoer. From where I sat, I mean, it looked pretty effective. There was some sloppiness, but I've said it before and I'll say it again. DeBoer was a home run for Alabama because he's an offensive guy that gets with a quarterback and some really talented freshman receivers that could use his acumen.
It was a pretty flawless beginning. And yeah, I mean, if you're watching it down by down, you're seeing things in the first half you don't like. And you're also, if you cover college football like we do, first game against Western Kentucky, and it doesn't make any difference. It's just a process. The fact Nick Saban was there may have been the biggest surprise to me. I mean, I kind of like figured Saban would show up when he had to, but he and Miss Terry. I mean,
maybe go bar hopping with McAfee or something.
I guess. I mean, I guess maybe he was just glad to get away from McAfee. He, but the game pretty meaningless other than the fact that it's the first game. But I remember 17 years ago, I stood there. I was there till midnight against Western Carolina. I mean, these are moments in time, Matt, when you cover college football that you make note of, and we won't ever mention this game again.
Let's put it this way: 28-0. I thought I was going to kick, or 28-0. I thought I was going to sit back, relax, and enjoy the fun. Dan Mullen looks at me. True story. He goes, Matt, there is way too much time on the clock for a team like Georgia. And looky there, we had an all-time classic from two teams that have given us all-time classics.
Yeah, and Matt, I don't want to get caught up in the moment. I mean, there's still people at bars in Tuscaloosa right now. So as we do this, but I think in my 4 decades of watching the SEC, it may have been the most dramatic game. I mean, it didn't have that walk off, but it came close to having a walk off. But it had everything else. Anytime you can see those type of swings. I mean, imagine if Alabama had lost that game. I tell you what it reminded me of a little bit. The 2008 Alabama Georgia, when Georgia was number, I think, 1 or 2 in the country. Alabama went up almost by the same score. Georgia had a shot at the end to win. It was just vintage. Whoever did the ABC SEC deal may not have gotten enough money for it because. I mean, I just cannot imagine anyone turning away from it. There was so much there.
Now, I wouldn't have faulted them if they turned away from it. I think at one point, and then again, it got to like 30-7.
Yeah, maybe.
And you think, well, wait a second. Now, and Mullen would also point out, he goes, no. 30-7. People love hopping in and watching Georgia get their ass kicked.
Yeah, good point.
So you've got the car wreck crowd, but Paul, it's one of those rare instances when you look at a game, it was so dominating at first for Alabama. And as I'm sitting there going, wow, Kalen DeBoer is making this look easy. He's calling a hell of a ball game. Jalen Milroe is the best player on the planet. But it's one of those instances where you leave a game, Paul, and I'm like, well, those are 2 of the best 12 teams in the country. Both of them are going to the playoff because Carson Beck looked awful. And credit to him and Kirby Smart for stabilizing enough to not only get back in the game, but take a 1-point lead late.
And that's the hardest thing in any sport, golf, tennis, whatever. When you come all the way back, you have to go ahead. Otherwise, you just completely crumble. And they went ahead. And I mean, I will ask the world, can we stop? Everyone in America and some parts of Arkansas know that Ryan Williams is only 17 years old. I mean, we get it. We've heard that 1,000 million times. But he made the play. You tell me. I mean, that's some of the greatest moves I've ever seen on one single play.
Yeah, and look, I'm guilty of it too because I think I said it during halftime and college football final 15 times. I find it absurd that in the history of Julio Jones, Amari Cooper, Jalen Waddle, Devontae Smith, name all the legendary Alabama receivers, this kid's the youngest, and he's already doing this. I mean, it's frightening thing about this, Paul, that you have that young man on Alabama, as their go-to guy as a true freshman.
Yeah, that was a concern. Not anymore. And yeah, and the combination of the athleticism between passer and receiver there is really beyond. It's just still hard for me to believe a year ago, Tommy Reese, the offensive coordinator, pulled Jalen Milroe. I mean, it's just, I mean, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what, I think he's in Cleveland or someplace right now. The coach ought to walk down and say, "You're dismissed. I don't care what you've done here," but he probably should be dismissed for what he's done up there as well.
You know what? Speaking of that, because you guys were doing SEC Nation yesterday, it's from Auburn, and then Auburn another
Oh,
steel victory from
we
the
don't have
jaws of
time for
defeat.
that.
But Nick Saban on College Game Day actually finally just came out and said it. He's like, I had to go to my offensive staff after it wasn't working with Milroe early and say, hey, here's who we have as a quarterback and an athlete. Here's how you're catering the offense to him because we have no other choice. And they did that. And obviously, they went to the college football playoff last year. But that's my segue into anyone who thought that we were going to get a, hey, Nick Saban's not at Alabama anymore, break from the tide. Kalen DeBoer's got in there and is like, you know what, dude, I'm an offensive genius and I've got the Alabama resources. You guys are screwed.
Yeah, I'm not sure. When I've seen Nick Saban's offense look like that. Of course, he was a defensive coach. But yeah, I mean, there's so many elements to the game, and in the end, I don't think any of them matter at this point because Georgia is not Georgia. Georgia can live with that loss.
Right.
Uh, they may be the only. I mean, they're not going 9-3, but if they did, that might be enough for that. That's that one we've been talking about because how can you penalize a team for doing what they did in that stadium in that environment? But I still can't figure out why Georgia can't get off after the opening kickoff. I mean, this is now a real problem for them
Mm-hmm.
and they nearly it nearly was insurmountable last night. Ultimately, it cost them the game because they started the Clemson game the same way. But Alabama just looks just beyond comprehension, and I think we've been hyping the wrong game on October 19th, Matt. As great as Georgia, Texas, what about Alabama at Tennessee? I mean, that might be the first 5.5 hour game in college football history.
Yeah. Oh gosh. I mean, last night for a little behind the scenes on what we do there at ESPN in studio. So we had college football final live at midnight, but we also had to take care of the halftime of Utah, Arizona. Those clocks were colliding with each other because of how slow the Alabama Georgia game ended up being at the end. We're like, one of these things has to end because there's about to be two television shows that are on live that we're not going to be able to handle. But Alabama, Tennessee, look, Paul, going into Saturday, and I think we kind of alluded to it a little bit last week on the Matt Barrie Show presented by Allstate that no one had really played anybody, right?
Well, we saw a new head coach at Alabama named Kalen DeBoer, who, after all the praise he got here last week, showed that the Nick Saban era is over. Because Nick Saban would have never lost that game, never did lose that game. And Matt, people talk about the La Monroe game in '07. That was he
Yeah.
inherited a 6-7 team that was 500. This is the worst loss I have ever seen by a quality Alabama team. I've seen bad Alabama teams lose to
Sure.
MU and to Monroe, but I've never seen a great Alabama team lose like this. And it is sending shockwaves through the Alabama ecosystem right now because for all the good that we felt a week ago, the questions that were lingering deep in the crevices of Alabama fans' minds are starting to pop up. And people are reminding us that even at Washington, you saw these very bizarre calls, and you know what I'm talking about. I think there was a game against Arizona State, was it last year? There were other games that Washington barely escaped. So yeah, there's a shock to the system, and what makes it even worse is Alabama has to play again this week against a fading South Carolina team, but it's the week after against Tennessee. And suddenly the numbers game is alive. But what you said a minute ago is true. I mean, I was in College Station yesterday, and I was being told that's the most important game of the day, and I don't even remember what I saw out there because so much has happened since then.
Yeah. So there's so many layers to this. And by the way, for those that hit me up on social media saying we can't wait for Finebaum and you to break it down, well, here it is because this is the Sunday we've been waiting for. Uh, part one. Well, first of all, I'm going to start with the most recent thing you said. Texas A&M Missouri was an embarrassment for Missouri. Their non-conference schedule came up and bit them yesterday, and Mike Elko completely outclassed them. We'll break down that game in a minute. But yes, that was supposed to be billed as the biggest game. It was the biggest laugher of the biggest games. So we'll touch on that in a minute. I came on this show. I came on your show. I went on Sports Center. I said it on Sports Center with you. I said that Kalen DeBoer was able to put closure to the Nick Saban era based on what he did against Georgia. And we thought that that was going to be legit because of how they won that game. Then yesterday happens, and I swear, Paul, it was almost as if you were sitting on set with us last night. I look at Dan Mullen and Joey Galloway. I said, here is Kalen DeBoer's biggest thing Sunday morning. Nick Saban would have had his team's attention after beating Georgia the way they did and baiting them to think Vanderbilt could beat them. He'd have been like, you're going to get beat by Vanderbilt. Now, DeBoer's got to explain how you go from the highest of highs, beating the class of the SEC in Georgia, to going to Nashville and losing to the team that's been the doormat for their existence in the conference. And that's the biggest. This isn't like they lost to Georgia and they went to Columbia and lost to South Carolina. Still stunning, maybe explainable. This one's tough because we've now seen the swing of the pendulum, the highest of highs and now the lowest of lows for Alabama football.
Yeah, and I mean, there have been bigger upsets in college football history.
Yes.
I would point to Jim Harbaugh and Stanford beating a number 2 USC. But even Stanford at the time wasn't a great power, but it had moments. But when you talk about college football and you mention Vanderbilt, you immediately get a laugh. I mean, it is like, remember, you're too young to even know, but back, in the 70s and 80s, it was like, oh, you got Slippery Rock for homecoming. Now it's Vanderbilt. And even though we both know what's going on there, they always find a way to blow it. And so this time it didn't happen, and it just seems surreal. And it reminded me a little bit. I covered that Vanderbilt game 40 years ago when Ray Perkins was the coach, and it felt very similar. That was 2 years after Bryant, and suddenly nothing felt right at Alabama again. And I'm not saying that this morning because I know what I said last week, and everyone knows it because it's been shown a million times. But there were old line Alabama fans that just didn't quite buy it, but it was because of the collapse at the end of in the second half.
Yeah.
And that came back yesterday. And Kalen DeBoer, I'm going to take you through his week. He's calm, he's cool. He came on our show Wednesday, and we went back and talked about the Georgia game. Can you imagine trying to get Nick Saban 4 days after a major win to say, Coach, I know you got Vanderbilt. Let's go back and talk. He would have bitten. First of all, he wouldn't have done the interview. Right. And then I'm watching SportsCenter Thursday night. There's Jalen Milroe. I mean, that did not happen under Nick Saban for a reason, Matt. Right. And I think what we're going to hear is this program's a little bit too loose. Whether it's NIL, I don't really know what it is. I liked it until I didn't like it Saturday afternoon.
Well, Alabama fans aren't going to like it. And again, for Kalen DeBoer, pardon me, Kalen DeBoer and the emotions, think about this. You go from, again, hey, we got the guy replacing Nick Saban. We're good. Now he's about to really understand what that Alabama job is all about. He's waking up this morning going, oh, hell, I just lost to Vanderbilt. And my team over the last 6 quarters has given up 67 points. There have been seasons where Nick Saban's defense, I believe it was 2011, they gave up 106 points or something like that the entire year. And so where you were the toast of Tuscaloosa last week, I mean, life comes at you fast in the SEC. I never thought it was going to be Vanderbilt. But he's really about to understand that this isn't Seattle anymore, and I think he's going to be fine. But this is an early wake-up call with a team that's loaded with talent that they're going to have to get it right quick, and maybe this is that shift in point where DeBoer's like, okay, guys, shut the doors. We're going to the bunker, and we're coming out when we're ready to play.
Matt, there are a lot of things about college football I don't understand very well, but there was one thing I do understand, and that's the culture of Alabama football. I spent 32 years in that state, and there is nothing like the week after a shattering loss. And that's not a loss to Georgia is not shattering. It's right. Okay. This is shattering. This is a shock to Alabama's manhood. I mean, all those Bama folks who called in shows, including mine, who were boasting and making and rubbing Georgia fans' face in the dirt and saying, "We're your daddy." They just lost to Vanderbilt. And I mean, I just don't know I think everybody appreciates how embarrassing that is. And then, I mean, Nick Saban, who rarely, and I'm not a big fan of the rat poison line. We all overdo it. But he's the one who said 2 weeks ago that, every place in the SEC is tough except Vanderbilt. And I don't know if that was a factor. Maybe it was, but it's still the fact that you just cannot respect it. I was on our Saturday morning show and I was picking this game and I gave all the reasons why Vanderbilt could make it interesting. But then I said what everybody else said. I can't pick Vanderbilt. I mean, you can't.
You cannot.
Because I thought Alabama would be flat. I mean, if you're smart and follow college football, how can you be up after the most emotional game I've ever seen? But Kalen DeBoer is about to experience things. Forget the football field. When his wife goes to the grocery store, when his kids hear things or read things, and it will be vicious. People appreciate what he's done, but this is inexcusable. I mean, there is no way to ever excuse. And people can say, "Well, you're being an elitist here." I don't care. There is no way to ever excuse the #1 Alabama ranked team losing to Vanderbilt. I mean, that is the one thing in the closet you cannot ever do. And he just did it, and he didn't waste any time doing it.
No, well, yeah, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe he just got it out of the way for the rest of his career there. Alabama was a team that were like, hey, look, they might have Kalen DeBoer, but they're still Alabama, which is a segue to it because LSU, you break into their schedule at Arkansas, at A&M, 2 tough road games in a row. Then they've got the Alabama game November 9th, and that brings me to the Crimson Tide, who, again, Paul, like if South Carolina had any semblance of reliable quarterback play, Bama loses 2 weeks in a row. I don't think anybody in Tuscaloosa would have looked at me with the straight face and said, hey, guys, by the way, you're going to go lose to Vanderbilt, and then the following week, you're going to need luck to beat South Carolina.
No, I mean, I was on a plane watching that game, and the responses I was getting from friends and then on social media, Matt, was downright scary. There's a cliche in sports that I abhor, and it's a win is a win. And the reason you say that is in playoff races, it's all that matters. But that game was so costly to Alabama. Because it showed that all the predictable things that we said, Nick Saban on down, didn't come true. Nothing changed. That team was worse. That team is on the brink. And Kalen DeBoer's smile is finally wearing very thin with the Tide faithful. They don't see the coach they thought they saw 2 weeks ago. They see someone who comes off weak, who comes off as a player's slap you on the back type of coach that doesn't really appeal to what Alabama football was built on. And I think Kalen DeBoer's season is definitely on the brink this weekend. We'll get to that later. But the negativity all week long and intensifying was incalculable. And quite frankly, I don't even know where we would have been with a loss. And again, I live in that Alabama world a little bit more than most people.
Yeah.
But 2 weeks in a row, two games that Alabama fans not only wanted to see a great performance, but lost a lot of money on. And it's starting to catch up. And I realize where we are. We're 7 games into Kalen DeBoer's first season. And I was the guy 2 weeks ago that said this team looks almost better coached than what we had seen in the last 2 or 3 years of Nick Saban. But it doesn't anymore. Kane Womack, the defensive coordinator, is now like everybody's least favorite coach in America. And where this season goes is impossible to predict how bad it's about to get.
Yeah, I mean, I sat here, I said it on this show, I said it on your show, Paul Finebaum show on SEC Network. I said, and convincingly, there's closure in the Nick Saban era after the Georgia game. I said, Alabama fans, rest easy. You're going to be just fine, even though Georgia came back and took the lead at that point, once being down 28-0. And so then when you look at those 6 quarters, they were up 14-0 against South Carolina. It is odd how the thing just switched to, and I don't think this is fair to Kalen DeBoer, but it's the job that he took. This stuff isn't happening with Nick Saban.
No.
You're not overlooking Vanderbilt. You're not letting South Carolina back in a game. Jalen Milroe's not throwing the ball away in the end zone and making it a safety when if he would just held on to it, it would have been forward progress to the 1 or 2. There are just so many things going on right now where you can now, Paul, remember, I thought you saw the difference with DeBoer 2 weeks ago relative to the Nick Saban era. You're seeing it the other way now, and that's not a good thing early on.
And man, I thought last year the Miami meltdown against Georgia Tech was one of the dumbest endings to a game I've ever seen. But had Alabama lost that game, and by the way, they were so close to doing that. I'm not sure I would have ever seen anything like that.
Happy Sunday. How's it going?
Yeah, Matt, every week we wonder, can it be more bewildering? But let's start with Alabama.
Okay,
Alabama.
okay.
I mean,
This show might be an hour today based on
Alabama. I mean, where can you go? I mean, Alabama is an absolute train wreck. There's no sugarcoating it, and I'm sure Kalen DeBoer and his cast of minions can try to act like they control. I actually heard somebody say Alabama controls its own destiny. For what? The end of the world? I mean, why would you now believe Alabama, after what we've seen the last 3 weeks, is now going to get off the canvas, beat Missouri, which is not great, but still formidable, because anybody is formidable for Alabama right now, and then go down to Baton Rouge and beat LSU after what we saw from LSU last night. And that's really the number one bullet point, I think, Matt. Yeah, we may wake up here in a couple of months and look back and go, "Wow, maybe we were wrong." But that's part of the conversation that exists here. But it's not the play on the field. It's a lack of discipline. I mean, every time they had a chance to put that game a little bit further away from Tennessee or to come back in the game, they made a stupid penalty. They made a stupid decision. And ultimately, who does that rest with? Is that the players or is that the coaching? To me, this does not look like a well-coached team.
So I brought this up on Sunday Bloody Sunday that there are things about Alabama that are starting to rear their head now, and it's unfortunate in that for 17 years, and look, what do we always say? You don't want to be the guy that replaces the legend. We're seeing it, Paul, right in front of our eyes. Because what happens every time Alabama has a misstep like that personal foul late in the game? Was he taunted by the Tennessee player? Yes. Should the Tennessee player have been flagged? Yes, but he didn't. Now you're 4th and 22. What we're seeing, Paul, is we're seeing an Alabama program who is so locked up for 17 years under Nick Saban. It's almost as if now that Saban's gone, everyone in the building relaxed. And we're seeing it on Saturdays with stuff we haven't seen in a decade plus. And if you hit on it, think about where we were, was it 4 Sundays ago today after Georgia? And we're talking about closure in the Nick Saban era. They got it right. Alabama could be better. They've gone Vanderbilt loss, South Carolina near miss, and Tennessee loss. This season, SEC playoff, they're out. They're done.
They're 0 for the state of Tennessee, in case anybody in the volunteer state was keeping track. Matt, listen, it was 3 weeks ago today. I sat here and talked about how Alabama looked better coached last night, meaning the Georgia game, than the last couple of years of Nick Saban. And I meant by that, it looked like they were together across the board. Saban did not have a great staff his last year. It was a mirage. And we certainly you can I don't even care about the Georgia game anymore because they threw it away. Whatever they did in that first half, they let it go in the second half, and they haven't gotten it back. And there's no reason to believe they're going to get it back, because I think the real issue now is Kalen DeBoer is going to experience things that no coach at Alabama has experienced in 2 decades, and that's all the noise. And the noise in Alabama is loud. I was in Alabama last week, Matt, for 2 days. And I mean, I was going through TSA at the airport, and somebody working at the airport grabbed me and said, "Hey, what's with this guy?" And I was like, "What guy?" He said, "The guy coaching at Alabama." I mean, that was before the Tennessee game. They didn't even want to mention his name. I mean, there was a bailout of DeBoer, and I'm not trying to say because I ran into a guy at a coffee shop or a guy at the airport that's the newest CNN, Fox, MSNBC tracking poll, but
Sure.
I talk to enough people, and I hear from enough people from that fan base, and they are besides themselves. And I mean, is it going to get better for Kalen DeBoer? I mean, he inherited a pretty good team.
Let's get to Alabama and LSU. Uh, Operator put me on through. I'm going to send you down to Baton Rouge. And Brian Kelly coming in 13-0 night games since he joined the program. And that was one of the most dominating, bludgeoning performances I've seen in that game. Two, here we sit, and Alabama's probably going to be in the college football playoff.
No, when they lost to Tennessee, it seemed over. They just didn't have a pulse. And they are back, and Kalen DeBoer has. I mean, he's coming close to cursing now. He, I mean, he's not. He doesn't look like the same coach we saw 4 weeks ago. And what do you say about Brian Kelly that hasn't already been cursed and uttered by tens of thousands of LSU fans? I mean, he went out and made a change at the defensive coordinator position. Looks like he might want to make another change. That was one of the poorest defensive schemes I've ever seen. Offensively, Nussmeier just simply, went in the tank. What we saw from LSU, Matt, should not have been a surprise. We've seen it every week. They screwed around the USC game. They absolutely shouldn't have beaten South Carolina. They beat Ole Miss in overtime on the final play to tie it in overtime and in regulation. And this is a team that's been living on the edge. And I'm foolish and many of us are foolish to think that they could correct it. They didn't. And Brian Kelly now is going to have to sell winning 10 games again, as if anyone will be listening.
Yeah, here's what I'll say about because I think Brian Kelly's one of the best coaches in the country. And yeah, he's going to win 10 games at LSU for the first 3 years. I believe with LSU, when you look at the NFL and you see Brian Thomas Jr., when you look at the NFL and you see Jaden Daniels and what he's doing, when you look at the NFL and see Malik Neighbors and everybody that they're doing, I just think that it was hard for LSU to replace that kind of production and be a legitimate contender. Like, look, I know Nussmeier, when he's good, he's good. I know Kyron Lacy's when he's good, he's good. But there was so much lost, Paul. I think we put it on them, and they weren't ready for it. But they're still going to win 10 games in the SEC, like on an SEC schedule.
No, well, because he is an elite coach, and therefore we expect him to do. And I'm not saying he should have prepared us better, because we all saw this. We all saw the flaws, but we all also bought in. I'm using the collective phrase. I frankly thought Alabama would win, because Alabama usually always wins. But,
Yeah.
but I think we just got hung up on false narratives. Brian Kelly's never lost a night. Well, he has lost in the daytime there. He he lost to Tennessee by 32 points a couple of years ago during at a noon start. But it's like the thing you saw all day yesterday, and you probably even uttered it because it was on the screen. This is the first time Georgia has lost to someone other than Alabama. I mean,
Yep.
I mean, it's like those other three losses didn't count.
Yeah. It was a wild day. I just want to throw out some Jalen Milroe superlatives before we move on. 185 yards rushing and 4 touchdowns. Second player with 4 rushing touchdowns in Alabama history, joining Sean Alexander. 8 career rushing touchdowns against LSU, the most by a single SEC player against a single opponent since Tim Tebow. Finished with 185 rushing yards, the most by an Alabama quarterback since Stedman Shealy, of course. Who doesn't remember him? So it was just that kind of a dominated performance. And I'll say this, coming out of the bye week for Alabama, what did we sit on here and say for that 3-week stretch when they just weren't that good? The offense was stuck. Kalen DeBoer is like, you know what? I got the best guy in the field and Jalen Milroe. To hell with all this airing it out. If I need to throw it, I'll throw it, but I'm just going to run the big fella, and we're going to win doing it that way.
Yeah, and by the way, LSU knew that too.
To me, was the biggest stunner of the day. Well, why is that? Because we sat here for the past month saying Alabama found it. They're fine. They figured out how to use Jalen Milroe. They got over that little 3-game hump. They're good. Alabama's going to get in the SEC championship. All things are fine in Tuscaloosa. And then they've lost 3 games for the first time, I believe, in 13 years since 2011. They didn't score a touchdown against Oklahoma, a 5-5 team. And now, Paul, here we are, Alabama out.
Yeah, Matt, it was 2010, the last time Alabama lost 3 games. That was after their national championship season. And I mean, there are so many check marks about this. I mean, we're in terms of last time Alabama scored 3 points, last time. Let me cut to the chase. It was simply inexcusable. And you can blame anyone you want, but you would be smart to start at the very top because that team did not look prepared. They didn't look focused. They didn't look like they had a clue what they were getting into. And I don't know how that could be the case because everyone who watches football knew that Brent Venables had an elite defense. They just have no offense because of all the wide receivers being hurt and chaos at quarterback. And I just don't understand it. And that loss was a body blow. And I know what my good friend Heather Dinich is saying, that there is a path for Alabama, and maybe there will be. But the real question is why? Uh, I mean, I don't understand how Alabama can be considered a legitimate playoff team, Matt. And I realize that there are probably schools in there that aren't legitimate either. But I mean, they've lost to Vanderbilt, a 5-loss team, and now Oklahoma, a 5-loss team. And if you were looking at a chart of the SEC, they're probably 12-13 out of the 16 in the league, and the other loss is at Tennessee. And I know who they have a win against, possibly the SEC champion. But please, if they get in, good for them. I'll be happy, and everybody will sing Kumbaya. But are they really a playoff team after what we saw on Saturday night? I mean, that was just hard to wrap my arms around. In the middle of the night, I'm getting texts from old line Alabama fans who are going, "What have we gotten ourselves into?" Because this is the same Alabama team in many ways. It's not. No, actually, it's not. It's a worse Alabama team than we saw against Vanderbilt. I mean, this team was completely clueless.
Lowest amount of points, fewest amount of points scored since 2004.
Coach was Mike Shula.
That's with a guy, your head coach, that's an offensive wizard in
Genius.
Kalen DeBoer. And look, can you make the connection? Yeah, Brent Venables had Alabama's number when he's the defensive coordinator at Clemson, so be it, fine. But when you look at what Alabama did to LSU, and then they have the walk with Mercer, in no war, they couldn't do anything. I mean, they were never a threat. I mean, in Jalen Milroe, we got on here. We didn't have to go check the tape. It's not tape, it's digital. But we didn't have to go check it after LSU. We sat here, Paul, and we're like, finally, use Jalen Milroe as a runner. He's the best athlete on the field. They tried to make him a thrower again last night.
Yeah.
And I just don't understand why that computed. I think the loss last night for Alabama was the worst loss of the season and the worst loss they've had in quite some time.
Yeah, Matt, so we all said, I said, the Vanderbilt loss is the worst loss in maybe the history of Alabama. It's possible this is worse, if it could be such a thing, because of what the stakes were. Alabama recovered from the Vanderbilt loss. And I think what we did is we read way too much into the Missouri win and the LSU win. DeBoer, I mean, yeah, there was a terrible call in the game, but did you see a game yesterday where there wasn't a terrible call?
Right.
If the Williams touchdown had held up, Alabama has a breath at least, a pulse. But yeah, and by the way, I'm a big fan of Brent Venables, but what he did against Nick Saban at in national championship games really doesn't have much to do. He's just a very good defensive coach, and that's all there is to it.
So it was clear, anybody watching football who knows football, it was clear that Venables went into that game and said, here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to let Jalen Milroe beat us with his legs. So we're going to stop him with his legs. We're going to make him a thrower. That was clearly the game plan last night. And we talked about this with Ole Miss. How does a team that's built with so much talent allow something like this to happen? And now Alabama fans, you have to be like, I don't. Year one of Kalen DeBoer, I thought they'd be 9-3 this year. I think anyone who didn't expect a little bit of a drop off, just wasn't reading the room. But something like this, I mean, if you're an Alabama fan, you should wake up a little bit angry and concerned about where this thing's headed.
Well, you are because you have the Iron Bowl this week, and you really don't know or maybe even care. Yeah, losing to Auburn will get you in a lot of trouble quickly, but Alabama doesn't build its season around the Iron Bowl like they did 50 years ago.
Right.
It's about being the best in the country, and again, yeah, I go back to a decision about 3 weeks into DeBoer's tenure that may be reverberating is when I think it's when Grubb, his OC at Washington, came and left to go to I think to the Seahawks.
Seahawks, yeah.
That may have been the most important moment of the year. Of course, it would have been nice to see Caleb Downs returning punch for Alabama last night. You never know, maybe a 75-yard punt would have ignited Alabama in the third quarter when they were completely comatose. Maybe he would have picked off a pass. I mean, just maybe would have been the best player on the field.
Rankings were just released within the last 2 minutes. The big story coming in, Alabama left out, SMU is in. Just first out of the gate, your reaction to everything we just saw on TV moments ago.
Well, I think what this committee did is what committees in intercollegiate athletics do. They try to pick their poison. In this case, they did not want to be responsible for killing conference championship games just yet. Video may have killed the radio star 30 years ago, but they did not want to be the ones who ended it because there's so much money involved and there's so many people on that committee, Matt, that are connected to big conferences. And they took the easy way out. They could have easily analyzed this differently, but clearly they decided that SMU did enough on Saturday night by coming all the way back from a blowout to nearly win the game. And they sat there as committees do and go, you know what, we appreciate their courage. And they went against everything they had said the previous Tuesday night, which is fine. I mean, listen,
Yeah.
we all saw this coming today. I mean, I'm not surprised. You're not surprised. I don't think Kalen DeBoer is surprised because this was built into the cake.
So there are a million things to get to here, and we will. And pardon me, I'm going to glance over the TV from time to time. They're just doing the live reaction as we speak. Now, the problem this morning, Paul, is there. Well, there's a few that we can unpack. First problem is this: it was unfair for this to come down to SMU and Alabama because we could have picked some other teams that maybe you could point at and be like, well, they didn't really have anything special either. But because a team like Penn State was ranked highly all year, they were going to get the benefit of the doubt no matter what. Because Indiana, with one loss, was ranked highly all year because of their story. They were going to get the benefit of the doubt. And it also didn't help them that Clemson, we talked about this last week on the Matt Barrie Show presented by Allstate, that Clemson was the one team that was going to steal a bid. And so the fact that it came down to SMU, I don't like that SMU is going to be picked on for this because they've had one loss all season in the regular season, BYU 10-2, top 15 team, and then to Clemson. It's unfortunate that that's what it came down to, but it did. Did they make the right decision in your mind taking SMU over Alabama?
I mean, as people that serve the intercollegiate athletic world, they did because of what I said in relation to the fallout. I think another thing, Mac, I heard this Friday in Atlanta among some SEC people that their biggest concern, if that scenario happened Saturday night, was that SMU would get in over Alabama. Could have been Ole Miss, could have been South Carolina, as you said. But because of what happened a year ago, when Alabama got in over FSU and everybody started threatening and filing suits, they didn't want to go through that again. And I think other than people in Alabama, nobody's feeling sorry for Alabama. And Matt, quite frankly, I don't know that many Alabama fans who feel like they got screwed. I mean, they did it to themselves. 2 weeks ago, we were sitting here talking about the blowout in Norman, and I think that haunted them. Well, that had nothing to do with this. If you listen to Ward Manuel on Tuesday night, uh, he laid out a scenario about strength of schedule and who did you beat, and that's what they used against Miami, but they didn't use that against SMU because they made it to a conference championship game.